She places the photo down like it weighs more than it should, just a faded image of two young lovers by the sea. Yet her hand trembles, as if letting go of it might make the memory vanish too. It's 6 in the morning, the park is empty, save for the rustling leaves and this one woman, wrapped in a woolen coat older than most trees around her. She sits on the same cracked stone bench, facing no one, speaking to nothing. Why has she come here every week for 31 years, to a place where no one remembers and no one waits? There's something about the way she looks at that empty seat beside her, something unfinished. Welcome to Echoes of Kindness. Come closer. There's a story on this bench that's been waiting to be heard. Let's begin. She didn't always sit alone. There was a time when her laughter rang across that same patch of grass, when her hands weren't wrinkled, but quick and clever, stitching names into handkerchiefs and sewing stories into fabric. Evelyn grew up in a seaside town where the wind smelt of salt and warm bread, and where days passed slowly, like tides drawing secrets back from the shore. Her world was small: a mother in poor health, a tiny tailoring shop by the post office, and quiet mornings walking to the park before customers began to knock. But it was enough. Then there was Thomas, never loud, never rushed, always with a pocket watch and ink-stained fingers. He wasn't from her world exactly, but he walked its edge. A clockmaker's apprentice who mended time for others, yet somehow always seemed to lose track of his own. He never spoke much to Evelyn, not with words. His language was different. A pressed flower left on her windowsill, scraps of paper with lines of poetry, carefully folded and caught between fence posts. She never saw him place them, but she always found them. Their first real conversation happened on that bench. It wasn't planned. He sat, thinking she wouldn't come that day. She sat, thinking the same of him. Neither moved, neither left. And slowly, over months, silence gave way to smiles, then words, then something softer still. He never said, "I love you." She never asked him to. But one winter's evening, he left her shop unusually late, a small box hidden in his coat pocket. Inside, wrapped in the same handkerchief she'd embroidered months before, lay a silver ring. Simple, quiet, just like him. He never came back. She searched. Of course she did. Not for a day, not for a week. For years. Police stations, hospital records, newspaper clippings. Every night she left the porch light on just a little longer. Every Sunday morning she walked to the bench with 2 cups of tea. The world told her to move on. She didn't, because grief, for Evelyn, wasn't loud. It was shalom, ritualized. It was the folding of his letters, the careful washing of that handkerchief, the way she ironed her dress before going to sit, as if he might still notice. And perhaps somewhere deep inside, a part of her believed he was still alive. Just lost, just not ready, so she made a promise. Not to wait forever, not to demand closure, but to keep showing up, as long as her legs would carry her, so that if, by some strange mercy, he ever did return, he would know she had never stopped remembering. And now, as a new figure steps into view, older, unfamiliar, her heart doesn't race. It listens. It waits. Because some part of her, the part that never needed proof, has always known. Let's go back to the beginning. It happened on the coldest night of the year. The fog rolled in thick from the sea, curling around lampposts and swallowing the hedgerows whole. The air smelled of frost and coal smoke, and the streets had that hushed quality, the kind that only appears when the world seems to be holding its breath. Thomas left her doorstep that night with a kind of quiet certainty in his steps. He hadn't said anything. He never did. But Evelyn had seen the corner of the handkerchief poking out from his pocket, the one she'd embroidered with a single letter, E. He'd been planning something. The road home wasn't far, just across the square, past the bakers, and down the hill towards the railway line. He would have made it too, if not for the lorry, a heavy, slow-moving shape lost in the fog. No one saw what really happened. Only the wreckage told the tale, the cracked windshield, the splintered wooden box, the faint scent of blood and engine oil. By the time the driver noticed, Thomas's body was already lying in the ditch. He didn't die. Not quite. A family, strangers passing through on their way to a farm further inland, Found him in the early morning, barely breathing. No wallet, no name, just a ruined pocket watch, a piece of torn paper with smudged handwriting, and a handkerchief soaked in red. They rushed him to a rural infirmary, miles from the coast. It would take hours before anyone knew he had survived, but even then, no one could tell them who he was. And when he woke, 3 days later, neither could he. Everything was gone, the seaside town, the clockmaker's shop, the bench in the park, even her name. To the nurses, he was just Matthew, a name picked from the Bible on the table beside his bed. It stuck because he didn't correct them, because he couldn't. His words were slow, his eyes distant. It wasn't just memory he'd lost. It was his rhythm, his belonging, like a puzzle shuffled inside out. And while Thomas, now Matthew, was learning how to walk again, to form new sentences, to write his name in unfamiliar letters, Evelyn was pacing the edges of a different world entirely. She called the hospitals, walked through every ward that would let her in, wrote letters to missing persons columns, left notices in shop windows. Weeks turned to months. People stopped asking. Even her mother, frail and worn, gave her hand a squeeze one evening and said, perhaps he wasn't meant to stay. But Evelyn couldn't let go. She remembered the weight in his steps that night, the way he'd looked at her without speaking, the absence in his leaving. Something in her refused to believe he had simply vanished. And so she held on, to the bench, to the letters, to the hope that one day the fog might return something it had taken. Meanwhile, in a village tucked behind rolling hills, Matthew began again, or rather someone else began in his place. He learned to fix clocks again, muscle memory that survived where his mind had faltered. His hands moved with a quiet precision, as though they remembered a life he had forgotten. The daughter of the family who saved him brought him tea every afternoon. Her name was Clara. She was kind, patient, and eventually necessary. They married in spring 2 years later, under an apple tree behind the farmhouse. It wasn't a love born of passion, not the kind that leaves notes in fences or walks in silence through winter parks, but it was warm and safe and gently built. They had 2 children. He taught them how to read time by feeling the weight of the minute hand. He grew to love them, not all at once, but quietly, like ivy climbing an old wall. Back by the sea, Evelyn kept a box beneath her bed. Inside, a copy of the last photo they'd taken together, a newspaper clipping from the night of the fog, and the handkerchief, now folded into a careful square. She never told anyone about the ring. No one knew he'd been carrying it. And then, 3 decades later, the tide shifted. It was a rainy Tuesday when Clara, now in her 20s, opened the attic to look for a suitcase. She found a trunk, sealed and dusty. Inside, a cracked watch, a weathered photograph, and a cloth embroidered with the letter E. She almost didn't mention it, but something about the look in the man's eyes in that photo, something about how the younger version of her father was holding hands with a woman she'd never seen before, unsettled her. She asked questions. He didn't answer. Not at first. He said he didn't know the photo, said the name meant nothing. But that night, he sat in the kitchen, long after the lights were off, turning the watch over in his hands again and again, as if waiting for it to tick. And just like that, the fog began to clear. Not all at once, but in shapes and shadows. A bench, a scarf, a name he couldn't quite pronounce, but felt like home. Clara made a decision, quietly, without drama. She booked a trip to the coast, told her father they were going on holiday. "You used to live here," she said casually, as they stepped out of the train station. He didn't correct her. His hands had started shaking. The park hadn't changed much. A few trees gone, perhaps. A new path laid near the fountain. But the bench, that bench, was still there. And so was she. Evelyn, now silver-haired, shoulders slightly bent, but with the same quiet dignity he had once admired from afar. She didn't turn around when he approached. She didn't have to. Somewhere between forgetting and finding, something in her had always stayed. And as he sat beside her, silent and unsure, she placed the photo into his hand. He looked at it, then at her. No words, just a tremor in the breath, a watering in the eye, not recognition, not quite, but something deeper, a knowing that once he had been loved like that. He didn't come back the next day, or the one after. Evelyn didn't expect him to. She had long since stopped believing in miracles. What she believed in, stubbornly and silently, was presence, the kind that didn't require an outcome. He had sat beside her. That was enough. But something shifted in her that morning. As she walked home, the wind pressing against her coat and the memory of his eyes heavy in her chest, she realized that a door had opened, and it wouldn't close again. Not entirely, for Matthew or Thomas as he once had been. The door was more like a crack in the wall, barely visible but enough to let something in. He didn't speak of the bench or of the woman, not to Clara, not to his wife, but his habits changed. He started waking earlier, sitting outside longer. Sometimes she caught him watching the horizon as if waiting for something to emerge. The past had become a pulse under his skin, not a memory, but a rhythm he didn't understand, only felt. And with it came the unease. He had built a life, a quiet one, modest and real. There were birthdays, burnt toast, children's laughter. There was love in its own time-worn way. Clara's mother, Margaret, had stood beside him in sickness and in health, through nights of confusion and years of ordinary routine. He had promised her his life. Now he wasn't sure if it was his to promise, because in the silence between thoughts, Evelyn's face returned, not as a longing, not even as regret, but as a question. Who had he been before he became safe? Before his life was measured in chores and calendar dates? He didn't dare speak these thoughts aloud, but they showed. In the way he ran his fingers over the cracked watch, in how he paused before answering simple questions, in the distance that began to grow, not out of cruelty, but out of displacement. Margaret noticed. Of course she did. They'd never been a dramatic couple. They never shouted. But one evening, she placed a hand on his and asked, as gently as she could, "Is there something you've remembered?" He looked at her, and for the first time in years, felt entirely lost. "I don't know," he said, "but I think I belong to someone else." She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She just nodded, as though she had known this day might come. And with quiet grace, she whispered, "Then find out and come back whole." So he did, or tried to. He returned to the bench twice more alone. The first time, Evelyn was not there. He waited an hour, then two. He left a note tucked between the wooden slats. It read only, "Thank you. I hope I didn't break something sacred." The second time she was already sitting, she didn't look surprised. "I never stopped coming," she said. He nodded. "I think I never stopped being here." There were no grand declarations, no promises. They talked about books, birds, clocks, tea, and beneath it all, a quiet current of grief and belonging, too fragile to name. Evelyn didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't ask her to wait, but something passed between them, a surrender perhaps, that even if time had betrayed them, memory had not. Yet outside that moment, reality closed in. His daughter grew suspicious. Margaret's silence became heavier, and he knew, as all people eventually do, that standing still was its own form of choice. Evelyn, too, felt the weight of return. Each time she saw him walk away, her heart folded slightly at the edges. She wanted to be selfless. She wanted to only feel gratitude. But at night, in the quiet of her home, she allowed herself to ache, not for what was lost, but for the impossible in-between, where love existed but had no name, where memory touched but could not hold. She began writing again, letters never sent. Pages filled with lines like, "I would have said yes," and "Did it hurt when you forgot?" In them, she was young again. Not foolish, but free. And then came the photo. One morning, folded inside a plain envelope on her doorstep. No return address, a photo of the bench, 2 cups of tea, her shawl beside him. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a moment kept, a proof that they had existed together, even if only between 2 Tuesdays, 31 years apart. And in that, something in her finally softened. Not closure, but peace. Because love, in the end, is not what we keep. It's what we're brave enough to let live, even in someone else's story. The next time Evelyn saw him, he was alone. No daughter, no camera, no explanation. Just him. Older, slightly hunched, a man made of hesitations, walking the gravel path toward the bench like someone following an echo. The wind stirred the dry leaves in tiny spirals, as if the trees themselves held their breath. He sat beside her without a word, and still she didn't look at him. They stayed like that for nearly 5 minutes, watching the same sky and listening to the same silence. Then he spoke, very softly, like a question he'd rehearsed too many times. "Did you wait for me?" She didn't nod, didn't smile, only answered with the kind of stillness that doesn't need confirmation. "Every Sunday," she said. It wasn't accusation, it wasn't grief, it was fact, plain and quiet, and somehow heavier than shouting. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out the broken pocket watch. The hand still frozen at the time of the accident. He placed it between them on the bench. "I never knew why I kept it, but I couldn't throw it away either," he said. "Some things stay, even when everything else fades." That was when she finally turned to him. Her eyes searched his face, not for recognition, but for something deeper, something more fragile than memory, something that might still be there. And it was. Not the same man, not exactly, but the tilt of the head, the quiet apology in the eyes, the way he rested his hands, one over the other, like someone always waiting for something to fix. And just when the moment felt like it might crack open with possibility, he asked the one question she had never let herself imagine. "Were we good in love?" It came out almost like a whisper. She blinked, once, then looked down. Her fingers traced the stitching of the handkerchief tucked in her sleeve. 31 years, and she'd never answered that question aloud. Not even to herself, but now she had to. "Not loudly," she said at last. "Not like books or films, but yes, we were." He nodded slowly, swallowed. And then, in a voice filled with something between guilt and awe, "I have a family now." And there it was, the twist of the knife. Soft, inevitable. She already knew, of course. Clara had written to her weeks before. A delicate, heartfelt letter explaining everything. The accident, the new life, the children. The fact that he had no idea she existed until the photo surfaced. That he'd chosen not to speak of it with anyone. Not even his wife. And now he was here, because he needed to know, not to return, not to rekindle anything, just to understand who he had once been. Evelyn looked at the watch on the bench, at the frozen hands, at the man who'd once carried a ring in his coat pocket and never got to offer it. She could have asked him to stay, could have wept, could have said, "But I waited." She had every right. But instead, she said this, "I'm glad you were loved again." He closed his eyes. Those words, so small, so precise, felt like absolution. They didn't talk much after that. They sat until the wind grew sharp, until the sky turned amber. And then he stood slowly, the watch still on the bench. He looked at her one last time. "You were the first person I ever wrote a poem for," he said. She smiled. Not because it was romantic, but because it was true. "I kept every single one," she replied. Then he walked away. Not forever, but enough. That night, Evelyn unfolded the letters again. The ones from before, the ones from after, the ones she'd written but never sent. And tucked among them was one more. Older, different paper, folded many times. She'd found it in the coat he left behind that night, but had never dared to open it. Now she did. It was dated the day of the accident. His handwriting was unmistakable. Careful, slightly tilted. "If you're reading this, it means I found the courage to do it. I don't know what you'll say, Evelyn. I only know that when I think of time, all those hours and days, I think of you. If it's not too late, I'd like to give you this, not as a promise of perfection, but as a beginning. Yours, always, T." She read it twice, then folded it back. And for the first time in 31 years, she didn't place it back in the box. She left it on the bench, beneath the watch, and walked away. Somewhere behind her, the wind turned the pages just once, then left them still. The next morning, Clara returned. She knew she'd find something. Not her father, he wouldn't come back again. That chapter had closed. But when she saw the letter, when she held the cracked watch in her hands, she sat down and wept. Not just for the time lost, but for the time held by a woman who had loved without needing to be remembered. She folded the letter gently, kept it in her coat pocket, and looked out at the sea. And in that moment, something shifted. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories don't end with a kiss or a reunion. Sometimes they end with a quiet knowing, a soft letting go, and the grace to leave beauty behind for someone else to find. Weeks passed. Evelyn didn't stop going to the park, but something had changed. Not in the world around her, but in the way she moved through it. She no longer brought the letters, no longer carried the photograph. She simply walked, sat, and watched the light shift through the trees. And for the first time in over 3 decades, she didn't measure the morning by waiting. She simply was. The past hadn't left her. It never would. But it had settled, like dust on an old shelf, present but no longer choking. People began to notice her more. A jogger who passed by most Sundays offered a nod, then a smile. A boy on a scooter once stopped to ask if she was waiting for someone. She only smiled and replied, "Not anymore." The bench was still hers, not because it held memory, but because it had become part of who she was. A place of quiet, of remembering without regret. As for Matthew or Thomas or whoever he had become, she never heard from him again. But that didn't matter. Some people returned to you in conversation, others in photographs. He returned to her in stillness, in the sound of the wind brushing the hedges, in the way the sunlight caught the corner of the path just before noon. Clara visited once more, not to talk, not to explain. She brought her daughter, a little girl with hair the color of beach sand and eyes wide with wonder. She ran circles around the bench while Evelyn watched, quietly amused. "She looks like him," Evelyn said softly, as if confessing a secret to the breeze. Clara nodded. "She's stubborn like him too." There was no bitterness between them, only a quiet reverence for something shared, even if only for a moment. Before they left, Clara handed her something wrapped in cloth. It was the watch, still broken, still beautiful. "I think it always belonged here," she said. And Evelyn, for the first time, took it in her hands not as something to mourn, but something to honor. Later that afternoon, she placed it beneath the bench, right at the base, tucked between 2 stones. She didn't want it to be found, not yet, but one day maybe someone would stumble upon it and wonder who it had once belonged to. Maybe they'd imagine a story of love lost, then found, then let go. Maybe they'd understand, or maybe not, but it no longer mattered. Evelyn's story didn't end with a reunion or a second chance. It ended with a choice, a soft, deliberate choice, to love without condition and to remember without grief. That's the quiet kind of bravery, the one no one sees, the kind that shows up every Sunday for 31 years and never asks for anything in return. And perhaps that's the truest kind of love, the one that doesn't need to be remembered to be real. Because some stories aren't about how things turn out. They're about how deeply someone loved, even when no one was looking. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with the gentle act of letting go. If this story stirred something quiet in you, comment 1, just so we know we're not alone in feeling it. And if you find this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.